All right, welcome in, everyone. We've got a really interesting deep dive today.
Yeah, looks like it.
You folks have sent in some documents, and this one is fascinating. It's all about a pretty major cybersecurity project
Hmm.
for a whole bunch of Philippine government agencies.
Hmm. Ambitious.
Yeah, Landbank of the Philippines seems to be the one kind of leading the charge here, and we've got Development Bank of the Philippines, the Home Development Mutual Fund, and Philippine Guarantee Corporation, all involved.
Lots of moving parts.
Yeah.
So,
So we are going to take a look at exactly what they're trying to accomplish with this whole shared cyber defense solution. We're going to take a look at the budget, which is, let me just, PHP 765,600,000
wow.
over 14 million US dollars.
That's a lot of pesos.
Yeah. And then see if we can spot any potential challenges, any kind of questionable assumptions maybe lurking in the plan.
Always good to be skeptical.
So first things first, shared cyber defense solution. What does that even mean? Like in plain English?
Yeah. So basically, instead of each of these agencies having, their own separate cybersecurity team and their own separate tools and everything, they're combining forces. Like they're going to create this one superpowered defense system.
So it's kind of like instead of having a bunch of smaller, weaker castles scattered all over the place, they're all going to band together and build like this one giant digital fortress.
Exactly. And, this kind of approach, it's becoming more and more common these days. As cyber threats, they just keep getting more sophisticated, attackers more persistent. Makes sense, right? Especially for government agencies
Yeah.
to kind of pool their resources, pool their expertise.
Right. So strength in numbers.
Exactly. So instead of each agency trying to fight off attackers all on their own, they can present like a united front. They can share critical information, share resources, all that.
Okay. So what exactly are they hoping to achieve with this mega defense system? The document, it kind of outlines a pretty ambitious wish list of capability.
It's a long list.
Yeah, give me some highlights. What are some of the things that really jumped out at you?
Okay, well, first of all, they want to be able to detect all sorts of sneaky attacks. Like if somebody's trying to steal login credentials or using everyday tools like PowerShell for malicious purposes, that kind of thing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and they're also looking for protection at a very deep level. They even want to be able to detect if someone tries to mess with the BIOS.
The BIOS.
Yeah, which is, it's basically like the core operating system of a computer. That level of security is usually reserved for highly sensitive systems.
Right.
And get this, they also want to keep tabs on the dark web to see if any of their information is being traded in those, shadowy corners of the internet. They're leaving no stone unturned, it seems.
Wow. So it's like they're building a digital Fort Knox.
It kind of is.
But with all that ambition comes a hefty price tag. 765,600,000 pesos. Is that really a reasonable amount for this kind of protection?
Well, that's the big question, right? And it's not one that we can answer with a simple yes or no. There are a lot of factors to consider.
Of course.
For starters, this budget, it covers a 2-year period. And it includes everything from software subscriptions and hardware upgrades to penetration testing, incident response training, and even the cost of all the specialized staff you need to run this whole thing.
Right. It's not just about buying a fancy piece of software and you're done. You need people who know how to use it and who can react quickly and effectively if something actually does happen.
Right. And when you consider the potential cost of a data breach, a successful cyber attack, those costs can be astronomical. We're talking regulatory fines, reputational damage, the cost of recovery, all that adds up. Suddenly, this investment might seem a lot more reasonable.
Especially when you consider these agencies handle a lot of very sensitive data.
Exactly. Financial data, personal data. I mean, the potential fallout from a breach, it could be huge.
All right, so we've got a pretty hefty budget. It covers a lot of ground. But let's get down to brass tacks. Is the per endpoint cost in line with what you'd expect for this level of protection?
So the documents, they actually give us the endpoint counts for each agency. And when you crunch the numbers, the cost per endpoint, it does seem to fall within, kind of average industry ranges. But remember, cybersecurity costs, they can vary wildly. It depends on a whole range of factors.
Right. It's not like buying a car where you can just compare prices based on features and mileage.
Exactly. Cybersecurity solutions are complex, The level of protection needed, it can vary so much from one organization to the next. It's really not one size fits all.
So what are some of the things that could make this project more expensive than they've anticipated?
Well, I mean, for starters, technology is constantly evolving. What seems cutting edge today might be completely outdated tomorrow.
Yeah, that's true in pretty much any tech field, but especially cybersecurity, I feel like.
Right. I mean, attackers are always finding new ways to exploit vulnerabilities. So these agencies, they're going to need to be prepared to continually invest in upgrades, updates, just to stay one step ahead.
And it's not just about the technology itself,
Yeah.
right? It's also about staying up to date on the latest threats, the
Mhm.
attack techniques, all that.
Exactly. And that's where threat intelligence comes in. They need to invest in gathering information about potential threats, analyzing trends, sharing that information with their security team. Because if you don't know what you're up against, it's impossible to defend against it effectively.
It's like trying to fight a battle in the dark.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the human element.
Ah, yes. Always the wild card.
Right. Even with the best tech in the world, a single careless employee, clicking on a phishing email, using a weak password, that can create a major breach.
Absolutely.
So security awareness training, that's super important.
You can have the strongest walls, the most sophisticated alarms, but if someone leaves the door unlocked,
Exactly. So they need to invest in training their staff, not just once, but on an ongoing basis. And they need to create this whole culture where security is everybody's responsibility.
okay, so it sounds like there are a lot of moving parts here, a lot of potential for things to go wrong. What are some of the specific challenges that could throw a wrench in their plans?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is just going to be managing the sheer complexity of this project. I mean, we're talking about four different agencies, right? Each one with its own systems, its own processes, maybe even its own kind of internal culture around cybersecurity.
In trying to integrate all of that into one uh, seamless shared cyber defense solution,
It's not going to be easy.
right? That sounds pretty complicated.
Yeah. They're going to need clear lines of communication, strong collaboration. Everyone needs to be on the same page, understand their roles, their responsibilities.
Otherwise, it could devolve into chaos pretty quickly.
Exactly. And even if they manage to get everyone on the same page, they still need to be prepared for the unexpected. I
Mm.
mean, cybersecurity, it's a constantly evolving field. New threats emerge all the time.
Right. So you can't just build a strong defense and then just assume you're good.
Right. They need to be constantly monitoring the threat landscape, adapting their strategies, being prepared to react quickly if an attack does occur.
So it sounds like flexibility, adaptability, those are going to be really key here.
Oh, absolutely. They can't just set it and forget it. They got to be constantly learning, evolving, improving their defenses, always staying one step ahead.
Okay, so we've talked about the budget, the technology, the human element. What about bias? I mean, in a project of this scale, there's got to be some potential for bias to creep in.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we always need to be on the lookout for biases, especially when we're dealing with something as complex as cybersecurity.
So in this case, what are some of the red flags that we should be watching for?
Well, one really common bias is this over-reliance on technology. It's tempting to think, okay, if we just buy the most expensive, most cutting-edge software, we'll be safe. But as we've already discussed, technology is only one part of the equation.
Right. Right.
You need skilled people, you need strong processes, you need a culture of security. It's not just about the shiny new toy.
So it's not a magic bullet.
Exactly. And there's always a risk that agencies will kind of get caught up in that and neglect the less glamorous but equally important parts of cybersecurity.
Like training and
Exactly. And then another potential bias is this vendor lock-in. It's easy to get seduced by a slick sales pitch, and then you end up tied to one particular vendor's solution, even if it's not the best fit for you in the long run.
and once you're locked in, it can be tough to switch.
Oh, yeah. Difficult and expensive. So these agencies, they need to be really careful to evaluate all their options. Choose solutions that are flexible, that are scalable and interoperable so they don't get trapped.
Right. Right. Avoid that golden cage.
Exactly. And then finally, there's this danger of tunnel vision.
Tunnel vision.
Yeah, it's that tendency to focus too much on preventing the attacks you already know about, and then neglecting the possibility that, well, something completely new could come along.
So you're preparing for the last war to the next one.
Exactly. And, cybersecurity, it's a constantly evolving field. Attackers are always coming up with new ways to exploit vulnerabilities. So these agencies, they need to be proactive. They need to be constantly monitoring the threat landscape, looking for emerging trends, ready to adapt their defenses as needed.
So it's not just about building a wall, it's about building a wall that can, move, change shape. as the threats evolve.
Exactly.
Okay, we've got a lot to think about here.
We do.
But I think I'm sensing a bit of a theme emerging.
What's that?
Flexibility, adaptability, a willingness to constantly learn and evolve. I think those are going to be key.
I think you're absolutely right. And those are things we need to keep in mind as we delve deeper into the specifics of their plan.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at that PHP 765 600,000.00 budget. Where is all that money actually going?
Right. Let's break it down. Because a big budget doesn't automatically equal good security.
All right, so one of the first things that jumps out is this significant chunk of money allocated to threat intelligence.
Mhm.
What exactly does that entail?
So essentially, it's like having a network of spies in the digital world. They're paying for access to information about potential cyber threats, the tactics that attackers are using, who they might be targeting, that kind of thing.
So it's about proactively gathering information to stay ahead of the curve, instead of just waiting for an attack to happen and then reacting.
You got it.
Yeah.
It's like having a heads up on what the bad guys are planning, before they even make a move.
And given how sophisticated cyber attacks are these days, this kind of proactive approach seems essential.
Oh, absolutely. You can't just build a wall and hope for the best anymore. You need to know what's coming over the horizon.
So what are some specific ways they might be using this threat intelligence?
Well, they could be using it to identify potential vulnerabilities in their systems, to prioritize security upgrades, or even to proactively block traffic from known malicious sources. It's about using information to make smarter decisions about their defenses and to try to anticipate those attacks before they happen.
That makes a lot of sense. But threat intelligence, that can be pretty expensive, right? I mean, how do we know if they're actually getting their money's worth?
That's a good question, and it's one that's really difficult to answer just from looking at these documents. I mean, the value of threat intelligence, it depends on the quality of the information, how relevant it is to these specific agencies, and then how effectively they're able to actually use it.
So we'd need more information to really assess whether they're making smart choices about their sources and how they're integrating it all into their overall security strategy.
Exactly. We can't just assume that because they're spending a lot of money on threat intelligence, they're automatically getting good results.
Okay. All right, let's move on to another big ticket item. They've allocated a significant portion of the budget to building a, a security operations center.
A SOC.
SOC. Okay, so what exactly is a SOC and why is it so important?
Think of it like the command center for all their cybersecurity operations. It's a centralized location where a team of security professionals will be monitoring systems, analyzing threats, responding to incidents, all in real time.
So it's like the 911 for cyber attacks. They've got their team of experts ready to jump into action at a moment's notice.
That's a good analogy. And a well-staffed and well-equipped SOC can make all the difference in preventing or mitigating a cyber attack. Because in today's world, it's not a matter of if you'll be attacked, it's when. So you need to be prepared to detect those attacks and respond quickly.
Time is of the essence.
Exactly. And that's where the SOC comes in. They can act as that first line of defense, identifying and containing threats before they can do serious damage.
Now, setting up a SOC, that can be pretty complex and expensive, right?
Oh, absolutely. They'll need to invest in specialized software, hardware, hire and train skilled personnel, establish really clear processes and procedures. It's a big undertaking.
And that's definitely reflected in their budget.
Yeah.
They've allocated funds for everything from security information and event management, SIEM systems to incident response tools, training and certification for their SOC staff. So it looks like they're taking this pretty seriously.
Yeah, it does seem that way.
But there's still some potential pitfalls, right?
Absolutely.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest challenges with SOCs is staffing. It can be really tough to find and retain qualified cybersecurity professionals, especially in such a competitive job market. And if you don't have the right people in place, your SOC just won't be effective, no matter how much money you throw at technology.
You can have the fanciest equipment in the world, but it's useless without skilled operators.
Exactly. And even with a great team, SOCs are only as good as the processes and procedures they follow. They need to have clear guidelines for incident detection, response, escalation. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of people sitting around looking at screens. They need to be able to work together seamlessly, efficiently, to be truly effective.
It's all about coordination, communication.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, another key area where they're allocating funds is vulnerability management and penetration testing. Those sound pretty intense.
They are, but they're also essential parts of any robust cybersecurity strategy.
Okay, so what exactly do those terms mean? Let's start with vulnerability management.
So basically, it's about identifying and mitigating weaknesses in their systems. They'll be using automated tools to scan their networks, their applications for known vulnerabilities. And then they'll take steps to patch those holes before attackers can exploit them.
So it's kind of like a digital checkup, make sure everything is up to date, running smoothly.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process. I mean, new vulnerabilities, they're discovered all the time, so they need to be constantly scanning and patching their systems to stay ahead of the bad guys.
Penetration testing takes things a step further.
Right. Instead of just looking for known vulnerabilities, they're actually hiring ethical hackers to try to break into their systems, just like a real attacker would.
It's like a controlled bank robbery, where the robbers are security experts helping to identify weak points.
That's a great way to put it.
So they're basically paying people to hack them.
In a way, yes, but it's all done ethically and with the agency's full consent, of course. The goal is to find and fix those vulnerabilities before a real malicious actor can exploit them.
Right. It's better to find the weaknesses yourself than to have them exposed by someone with bad intentions.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, how do they plan to handle things if an attack actually does occur? They've budgeted for incident response, but what does that involve in practice?
So, incident response is all about having a plan in place for when things go wrong. It involves establishing procedures for detecting, containing, and recovering from a cyber attack. Minimizing the damage, reducing downtime, recovering quickly.
So it's like having a fire drill, but for cyber attacks.
Exactly. And by having that well-defined incident response plan in place, these agencies, they can minimize the damage, reduce downtime, and ultimately recover more quickly from an attack. It's a crucial part of any comprehensive cybersecurity strategy.
Because no matter how strong your defenses are, there's always a chance that something will slip through the cracks.
Exactly. And when that happens, you need to be ready to act fast.
I'm noticing a bit of a trend here. A lot of these budget items, they seem to be focused on proactive measures rather than reactive ones.
That's a great observation, and it really reflects how cybersecurity is changing these days.
Okay.
Well, in the past, organizations, they often focused on building strong perimeter defenses, like firewalls, intrusion detection systems. But today, it's pretty widely recognized that prevention alone, it's just not enough.
Because attackers are getting more sophisticated?
Exactly. They're constantly finding new ways to bypass those traditional defenses. So organizations need to shift their focus to detection and response.
So you're assuming that breaches will happen, and you have a plan in place to deal with them.
Exactly. It's about being prepared for the inevitable. And that requires a different mindset than just trying to build an impenetrable fortress.
It's about resilience,
It is.
adaptability.
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like they're on the right track with this budget allocation.
Yeah, it seems so. But there are still some potential pitfalls we need to be aware of.
Like what?
Well, one potential issue is that they might be overspending in certain areas while neglecting others. For example, they've allocated a significant amount to threat intelligence and the SOC, which is great. But what about security awareness training for their staff?
Right, because as we said earlier, the human element is often the weakest link in the cybersecurity chain.
Exactly. So we need to make sure they're not overlooking that crucial aspect.
Right, you can have the best technology in the world, but it's all for nothing if your employees are clicking on phishing links and using weak passwords.
Exactly.
All right, what else?
Another potential issue is that vendor lock-in that we talked about earlier. It's easy to get seduced by a slick sales pitch and end up tied to one particular vendor's solution, even if it's not the best fit in the long run. So they need to be careful to evaluate all their options, choose solutions that are flexible, scalable, interoperable. Avoid getting trapped in that golden cage.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, there's also the danger of tunnel vision, that tendency to focus too much on preventing known attacks and neglecting the possibility that completely new threats could emerge. Like we were saying earlier, preparing for the last war instead of the next one.
So they need to be proactive, constantly monitoring the threat landscape.
Exactly. Cybersecurity is a constantly evolving field. Attackers are always coming up with new ways to exploit vulnerabilities, so they need to be ready to adapt their defenses as needed. It's not just about building a wall, it's about building a wall that can move and change shape as the threats evolve.
All right, so it sounds like they're on the right track with their budget allocation, but they need to be mindful of these potential pitfalls. And remember that cybersecurity, it's not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process.
Exactly. You can't just set it and forget it. You got to be constantly learning, evolving, and adapting to stay ahead of the bad guys.
And that requires a long-term commitment to investment. not just in technology, but in people as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've looked at the budget from a high level. We've examined some of the key areas where they're planning to spend their money. Now let's zoom in on some of the specifics. Are there any line items that seem particularly interesting or that maybe raise a red flag?
Well, one item that caught my eye was the amount allocated to data loss prevention, or DLP.
The
Yeah. DLP solutions, they're designed to prevent sensitive data from leaving the organization's control, so they can monitor and block data transfers, scan emails and attachments for sensitive information, even encrypt data, both data at rest and data in transit.
So preventing data leaks, whether it's intentional or accidental.
Exactly. And it's an increasingly important area of cybersecurity these days, especially with the rise of remote work and cloud computing. I mean, data isn't confined to the office anymore, it's everywhere.
And that makes it much more difficult to protect.
Exactly. So investing in DLP is a smart move. But it's really important that they choose the right DLP solution for their specific needs. There are tons of different options out there.
Right. Not all DLP solutions are created equal.
Right, and then they need to make sure they're implementing it correctly. DLP can be pretty complex, and if it's not configured properly, it can create more problems than it solves.
So it's another area where they need to be careful, do their due diligence.
Exactly.
Okay. Anything else in the budget that jumps out at you?
Well, they've allocated a decent amount to security awareness training, which is good to see.
Yeah, because like we've been saying, the human element is often the weakest link.
Right. So investing in training for their staff is absolutely essential. But it's important to remember that security awareness training, it's not a one-time thing. It needs to be an ongoing process.
People forget things. New threats emerge. Bad habits creep back in.
Exactly. So they need to provide regular refreshers, keep their staff updated on the latest threats and best practices.
And it's not just about providing the information, right? It's got to be engaging, relevant to their everyday work.
Absolutely. You got to create that culture of security where everyone understands the importance of protecting sensitive information and where they feel comfortable reporting any suspicious activity.
Right, because often employees are the first line of defense.
Exactly. They're the ones who are most likely to spot that phishing email or notice something unusual happening on their computer.
So they need to feel empowered to speak up, report anything that seems off.
Okay.
Okay, so they're investing in technology, they're building a SOC, they're conducting penetration testing, they're providing security awareness training. It sounds like they're covering all the bases.
It does seem like they're taking a pretty comprehensive approach, but we need to remember that cybersecurity is not a checklist, right?
It's not something you can just check off and forget about.
Right. It's an ongoing process. It requires constant vigilance, adaptation, improvement. And it's not just about the technology or the budget. It's about creating that culture of security where everyone understands the importance of protecting sensitive information.
And where everyone feels empowered to play their part in keeping the organization safe.
Exactly.
All right, so we've looked at the budget in detail. We've identified some potential areas of concern. Now let's step back and consider the bigger picture. What are some of the broader challenges that could impact the success of this project?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is simply the rapid pace of technological change. What seems cutting edge today might be obsolete tomorrow, and that's especially true in cybersecurity.
Because attackers are constantly developing new techniques, exploiting new vulnerabilities.
Exactly. So these agencies, they've got to be prepared to continually invest in upgrades, updates, just to stay ahead of the curve.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
can't just aim where it is now. You got to predict where it's going. And that requires a lot of flexibility, adaptability.
Okay. So technological change. What else?
Well, another big challenge is just the increasing complexity of the threat landscape. I mean, we're seeing more sophisticated attacks, more organized cybercrime groups, even nation-state actors getting involved. So these agencies need to be prepared to face a much wider range of threats.
That sounds like a pretty tall order.
It is, and it's not something they can do alone. They need to collaborate, share information, pool their resources. No single organization can defend against everything these days.
Okay, so we've got technological change, we've got a complex threat landscape, we've got the need for collaboration.
Yeah.
What else?
And then there's the human element. We've talked about security awareness training, but it's not just about training people on specific procedures. It's about creating a culture of security where everyone gets it. They understand the importance of protecting sensitive information, and where people feel empowered to speak up if they see something suspicious.
Right, because often employees are the first ones to spot something like a phishing email or something weird happening on their computer.
Exactly. So they need to feel comfortable speaking up, reporting anything that seems off, and they need to know that their concerns will be taken seriously.
It's not just about telling people what to do. It's about creating an environment where they feel comfortable doing the right thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got technological change, a complex threat landscape, the need for collaboration, and the human element. Those are some pretty significant challenges.
They are, and they're not going away anytime soon.
So these agencies need to be realistic about what they're facing and be prepared to adapt, to change their strategies as the threat landscape changes. It's not a one-time fix. It's a constant process.
A marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at the budget, the technology, the potential challenges, the importance of that human element. What are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that cybersecurity, it's not just about technology.
Right. It's about people, processes, and a culture of security.
Exactly. It's about understanding the risks, making informed decisions about how to mitigate them, and being proactive, not reactive.
You can't just wait for an attack to happen and then try to clean up the mess. You've got to be constantly learning, evolving, and adapting to stay ahead.
You got it. And that requires a long-term commitment to investment, both in technology and in people.
It's not just about spending money, it's about spending it wisely.
Exactly. And creating that culture of security that permeates the entire organization.
All right. I think that's a great place to wrap up for today. We've covered a lot of ground. I think our listeners have a much better understanding of this very complex and important project now.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about.
Thanks for taking the time to break it all down for us.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, remember, cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay safe online. Okay, so let's get back into it. We were looking at the schedule of prices form, trying to see exactly what they're planning to buy with all this money. This PHP 765,600,000.
Right. Got to see where the money's going because just having a big budget, it doesn't automatically mean they're going to have good security.
So one of the first things that jumps out at me is this pretty big chunk of money they've set aside for threat intelligence. What exactly is that?
Threat intelligence, think of it like having spies, but in the digital world. They're paying for access to information about potential cyber threats, what tactics are attackers using, who are they going after, all that kind of stuff.
So it's about proactively gathering information so they can stay ahead of the game instead of just waiting around for an attack and then reacting.
Exactly. It's like getting a heads up on what the bad guys are cooking up before they even try anything.
Okay. And with cyber attacks getting more and more complex, I can definitely see how that kind of proactive approach would be important.
Oh, absolutely. It's not enough to just build a wall and hope for the best anymore. You got to know what's coming over the horizon.
So how would they actually use this threat intelligence? I mean, what are some concrete examples?
Well, they could use it to find weaknesses in their systems, vulnerabilities, and then prioritize, okay, which security upgrades are most important. They could even use it to block traffic from known bad sources proactively. So it's about using this information to be smarter about their defenses and hopefully stop attacks before they even happen.
Makes sense. But this threat intelligence stuff, it can be really expensive, right? How can we tell if they're actually getting their money's worth? I mean, is there a way to measure that?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's really hard to say for sure just from these documents. The value of threat intelligence depends on a lot of things. How good is the information? Is it actually relevant to these agencies? And can they actually use it effectively? So we need more information to really say, yeah, they're making smart choices about this. We can't just assume that spending a lot of money equals good results.
Okay, let's move on to another big item here. They've allocated a huge chunk of the budget to building a security operations center, or SOC.
Right, a SOC.
So what exactly is that, and why is it so important?
A HSC, think of it like the central command for all things cybersecurity. It's a place where a team of security pros are constantly monitoring systems, analyzing threats, responding to any incidents that pop up, all happening in real time.
So it's like the cybersecurity equivalent of 911. You've got a team of experts ready to jump into action if something happens.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And a SOC that's properly staffed, well-equipped, can make a huge difference. It can mean preventing an attack, or at least containing it before it gets out of control. Because these days, it's not a question of if an attack will happen, it's when.
So you got to be ready.
Exactly. And that's where the SOC comes in. They're that first line of defense, trying to stop those threats before they can do any real damage.
Now, setting up a SOC, that sounds like a pretty complex and costly undertaking.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They'll need to invest in all sorts of special software and hardware, hire skilled people, train them, and you got to have really clear processes, procedures for everything. So, yeah, it's a big deal.
And they've definitely budgeted for it. I'm looking at the numbers here. They've allocated funds for, let's see, security information and event management systems. SIM systems, is that how you say it?
Yep, Sam.
SAM systems, incident response tools, all kinds of training and certification for their SOC staff. So it definitely looks like they're taking this seriously.
Yeah, it does.
But are there any potential, like, downsides, things that could go wrong, even with all this investment?
Oh, for sure.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest challenges with SOCs is staffing. Finding qualified cybersecurity professionals and then keeping them, it can be a nightmare, especially in a competitive job market. And if you don't have the right people in place, it doesn't matter how much fancy tech you buy. Your SOC just won't be effective.
Right. You can have the best tools in the world, but if you don't have the people who know how to use them.
Exactly. And even with a great team, you got to have good processes in place. Clear guidelines for everything. How do you detect an incident? How do you respond? Who do you escalate to? If you don't have that stuff figured out, it's just a room full of people staring at screens. It's got to be a well-oiled machine.
So coordination, communication, all that stuff is key.
Absolutely.
Okay. Moving on. I see they've also set aside a chunk of money for vulnerability management and penetration testing. Those sound pretty serious.
They are serious, but also crucial. You need those for any solid cybersecurity strategy.
Okay, break it down for me. What are we talking about here? What's vulnerability management?
So it's basically about finding any weaknesses in their systems, anything a hacker could exploit, and then fixing them before the bad guys can get in. They'll use automated tools to scan their networks, their applications, looking for known vulnerabilities, and then patch those holes.
So it's like a regular checkup for their digital infrastructure,
Yeah.
making sure everything's up to date, running smoothly.
Exactly. And it's got to be an ongoing thing. New vulnerabilities are discovered all the time, so you got to constantly be scanning and patching, always staying one step ahead.
And then penetration testing takes things a step further, right?
Right. So instead of just looking for known vulnerabilities, with penetration testing, you're actually hiring ethical hackers to try and break into your systems, just like a real attacker would.
It's like a bank robbery. But the robbers are the good guys, helping you find the weak spots.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. They're basically paying people to hack them, but it's all above board, completely ethical. The goal is to find and fix those vulnerabilities before a real bad guy can find them and exploit them.
Yeah, better to find those weak spots yourself than have some malicious actor find them for you.
Exactly.
Now, what happens if, despite all this, an attack actually does occur? I see they've budgeted for incident response. But what does that actually look like in practice? What do they do?
Incident response is all about having a plan. So when something bad happens, you know exactly what to do. It's about having procedures in place for how to detect an attack, contain it, and then recover from it. Minimize the damage, get things back up and running as quickly as possible.
So kind of like a fire drill, but for cyber attacks.
Exactly. By having that plan in place, they can hopefully minimize the impact of any attack. It's a vital part of any good cybersecurity strategy.
Because no matter how good your defenses are, there's always the chance something will get through.
Absolutely. And when that happens, you need to be ready to act quickly.
I'm noticing a bit of a pattern here. It seems like a lot of the budget items we've talked about so far, they're focused on being proactive rather than reactive.
You're right. That's a great observation. And it really reflects how cybersecurity is changing these days.
How so?
Well, back in the day, the focus was all about building strong perimeter defenses. Firewalls, intrusion detection systems, things like that. But these days, it's pretty clear that prevention alone just isn't enough.
Attackers are getting better, finding new ways to get in.
Exactly. So the focus has shifted to detection and response. You have to assume that breaches will happen and be prepared to deal with them when they do.
So it's about being ready for the inevitable.
Exactly. You're not trying to build a perfect fortress anymore. You're building something that's resilient, adaptable.
Okay. So it sounds like they're on the right track with how they're allocating the budget.
Yeah, for the most part. But there are still some potential traps they could fall into.
Like what?
Well, for one, they could end up spending too much in some areas and neglecting others. For example, they've put a lot of money into threat intelligence and the SOC, which is great. But what about security awareness training for their staff?
Right. We talked about that earlier. The human element is so often the weakest link in the chain.
Exactly. So they got to make sure they're not overlooking that.
Right. You can have the most advanced technology in the world, but if your employees are clicking on phishing links and using weak passwords, it's all for nothing.
Exactly.
What else? What other potential pitfalls should we be watching out for?
Well, there's the whole vendor lock-in thing we talked about earlier. It's so easy to get sucked in by a slick presentation and end up tied to one specific vendor, even if it's not really the best solution for you in the long term. So they got to be careful to evaluate all their options, make sure they choose solutions that are flexible, scalable, interoperable,
Absolutely.
avoid getting stuck.
Right. Don't get trapped in a golden cage.
Exactly. And then there's the danger of tunnel vision, focusing too much on the threats you already know about, and forgetting that new threats are emerging all the time. Like we said earlier, it's about preparing for the next war, not the last one.
So staying proactive, always monitoring the threat landscape.
Exactly. Cybersecurity is constantly evolving, attackers are always coming up with new tricks. So they got to be ready to adapt, to change their defenses as needed. It's not just building a wall, it's building a wall that can move, change shape as the threats evolve.
So it sounds like they're on the right track with the budget, but they need to be aware of these potential pitfalls. And remember that cybersecurity, it's not a one and done deal. It's an ongoing thing.
Absolutely. You can't just set it and forget it. You got to keep learning, evolving, adapting if you want to stay ahead of the game.
And that takes commitment, both in terms of investing in technology and in investing in your people.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, so we've looked at the budget from a high level, and we've dug into some of the key areas where they're planning to spend their money. Now, let's get even more specific. Are there any particular line items that stand out to you, either in a good way or maybe something that raises a red flag?
Well, one line item that caught my eye was the amount they're allocating to data loss prevention, DLP.
ELP. Okay, what's that all about?
So DLP solutions are designed to prevent sensitive data from leaking out of the organization. Whether it's intentional or accidental, they can monitor and block data transfers, scan emails for sensitive information, even encrypt data so it's protected both when it's stored and when it's being transmitted.
So it's about stopping data leaks.
Exactly. And it's a big deal these days, especially with more and more people working remotely using the cloud. Data isn't just sitting in the office anymore, it's everywhere.
And it makes it a lot harder to protect.
For sure. So investing in DLP is a smart move. But they got to make sure they're choosing the right solution. There are a ton of options out there, and some are definitely better than others.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
And they need to make sure they're implementing it correctly. DLP can be tricky, and if it's not set up right, it can actually cause more problems than it solves.
So another area where they need to be careful, do their homework.
Definitely.
Okay. Anything else in the budget that stands out to you?
Well, they've put a decent amount towards security awareness training, which is good to see.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about how important the human factor is.
Right. I mean, your employees can be your biggest asset, but they can also be your biggest vulnerability. So investing in training is absolutely crucial, but it can't just be a one-time thing.
People forget things, new threats pop up, bad habits can come back.
Exactly. So you got to do regular refreshers, keep everyone updated on the latest threats, the best ways to protect themselves and the organization.
And it's not just about giving people information, right? It's got to be engaging. You got to make it relevant to their day-to-day work.
For sure. You want to create a culture where everyone understands how important security is and where they feel comfortable reporting anything that seems fishy.
Right, because often it's the employees who are the first to spot something like a phishing email or some weird activity on their computer.
Exactly. So they need to feel empowered to speak up, to report anything that seems off.
And know that their concerns will be taken seriously.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got the technology, the SOC, penetration testing, security awareness training. It sounds like they're really trying to cover all their bases here.
Yeah, they're definitely taking a comprehensive approach. But you got to remember, cybersecurity isn't like checking boxes on a list.
It's not something you can just do once and then forget about it.
Right. It's an ongoing process. It's about
Yeah.
constantly being vigilant, adapting, improving. It's about more than just the technology and the budget. It's about building a culture of security where everyone understands how important it is to protect sensitive information.
And everyone feels like they have a role to play in keeping the organization safe.
Exactly.
All right, so we've dug into the budget, identified some potential concerns. Now let's zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture. What are some of the broader challenges that could impact the success of this whole project?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is just the sheer speed of technological change these days. What seems cutting edge today might be completely outdated tomorrow, and that's especially true in the world of cybersecurity.
Because the bad guys are always coming up with new ways to attack, new vulnerabilities to exploit.
Exactly. So these agencies, they got to be ready to constantly invest in upgrades, updates, just to keep up.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly. You can't just aim where it is now, you got to predict where it's going. And that takes a lot of flexibility, a lot of adaptability.
Okay, so rapid technological change is a big challenge. What else?
The threat landscape is constantly evolving and getting more complex. We're seeing more sophisticated attacks, more organized cybercrime groups, even nation states getting involved. These agencies need to be ready to deal with a whole range of threats, from, the opportunistic script kiddie to highly skilled, well-funded adversaries.
That's a lot to handle. And they can't do it alone.
Right. Collaboration is key.
Yeah.
They need to work with other organizations, share information, pool resources. No one can go it alone in cybersecurity these days.
Okay, so we've got the rapid pace of technology, the complexity of the threats, the need for collaboration. Anything else?
And then there's the human element. We've talked about security awareness training, but it's about more than just teaching people specific procedures. It's about building a culture of security where everyone understands how important it is to protect sensitive information, where people feel empowered to speak up if they see something that seems wrong.
Right, because often the employees are the ones who are in the best position to spot a phishing email or some other kind of suspicious activity.
Exactly. So they need to feel comfortable speaking up, reporting anything that seems off, and they need to know that their concerns will be taken seriously.
It's about creating an environment where people feel like they can do the right thing.
Exactly.
So we've got rapid technological change, a complex and evolving threat landscape, the need for collaboration, and the ever-present human element. That's a lot of challenges.
It is, and these are challenges that aren't going away anytime soon.
So these agencies need to be realistic about what they're facing and be ready to adapt to change their strategies as the situation changes. Cybersecurity is not a one-time fix, it's an ongoing process.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at the budget, the technology, the challenges, the importance of the human element. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to keep in mind?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that cybersecurity is not just about technology.
Right, it's about people, processes, and building a culture of security.
Exactly. It's about understanding the risks you face and making smart decisions about how to minimize them. And it's about being proactive, not just waiting for something bad to happen and then reacting.
You got to be constantly learning, evolving, adapting if you want to stay ahead of the game.
You got it. And that takes commitment, both in terms of the resources you invest and the way you build your team.
It's not just about spending money, it's about spending it wisely and creating a culture where everyone understands that security is everyone's responsibility.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so we've talked about the budget, the challenges these agencies are facing, but how do they actually know if this whole shared cyber defense solution is actually working? How do you even measure success in something like cybersecurity, where the threats are always changing?
That's the big question, right? And it's good news they actually address that in the document.
Oh, good. So they're not just throwing PHP 765,600,000 at the problem and hoping for the best.
Doesn't seem like it. Looks like they're taking a more structured approach, They've laid out specific metrics, reporting requirements, so they can actually track their progress, see if they're getting a return on their investment.
Okay, so what kind of metrics are we talking about here? Get into the nitty-gritty.
So first off, they've got these pretty strict service level agreements, SLAs, for the service provider.
SLAs, okay.
Yeah, so these cover things like how quickly do they respond to security incidents? How often are they running vulnerability scans? What's the uptime for their security monitoring tools? So it's about setting clear expectations for the vendor, holding them accountable.
So they're not just taking the vendor's word for it, that everything's running smoothly.
Nope. They want to see the data. They've specified a whole bunch of reports they expect to get to. Monthly performance summaries, incident response reports, threat intelligence updates, you name it. They even want an annual executive summary that gives a high-level overview of the whole security posture for all the agencies.
Wow. So they're really trying to get a complete picture of how things are going.
Yeah, they're not messing around. Which is good because data is only useful if you actually know how to analyze it,
They need to be
right?
able to make sense of it all.
Exactly. So they'll need to have processes in place for analyzing all this data, looking for trends, making adjustments to their strategy as needed. It's about using the data to continuously improve and to prove that this whole cybersecurity investment is actually worth it.
Now, one thing I'm curious about, we've talked about how important security culture is, but how do you actually measure that? It seems kind of intangible, you know?
Yeah, it's a tough one. A lot of organizations struggle with this. There's no easy answer. But one approach is to track things like how many people are completing the security awareness training, how many people are clicking on those phishing simulations, are employees reporting security incidents. It's not perfect, but it can give you some idea of whether your efforts are actually making a difference.
Yeah, it's about looking for those signs that things are moving in the right
Yeah.
direction. Okay, so they've got the metrics, the reporting requirements, but how do they know, like big picture, if this whole thing has been a success? What's the ultimate measure?
But that's where it gets a little philosophical, you know? I
Yeah.
think ultimately success in cybersecurity is about managing risk. You can't eliminate risk entirely, but you can do things to reduce your exposure, make yourself a less appealing target. It's about making smart choices about where to invest your resources, what level of risk you're comfortable with.
And constantly evaluating, adapting, learning from your mistakes.
Exactly. It's not a destination, it's a journey.
Yeah, well said. And I think these agencies, they're definitely embarking on a pretty important journey with this project. It's a big investment,
Hmm.
and they're taking it seriously, trying to do it the right way. I mean, there will be bumps along the way, but I'm optimistic that they can pull it off.
Me too. And at
Yeah.
the end of the day, that's what matters, right? Protecting their systems, their data, and the people they serve.
All right, deep divers. We've reached the end of our journey today. We've explored the ins and outs of this Philippine cybersecurity project, and hopefully you've learned a few things along the way.
It's been a fascinating deep dive, for sure.
It really shows how crucial cybersecurity has become for everyone, really. Governments, businesses, individuals, we're all navigating this digital world, and we all need to be aware of the risks.
Couldn't agree more. Staying informed, being vigilant, thinking proactively, those are the keys.
So until next time, deep divers, stay safe out there. And remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about cybersecurity, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the digital world safely and confidently.